The Webway, a vast network of hidden and convoluted pathways that spans across the universe, is one of the most enigmatic and crucial elements of Eldar civilization. Picture this: the Webway isn't just a means of travel, it's a lifeline. For the Eldar, it's more than a series of tunnels or portals. It's the key to their survival, their empire's stability, and their very way of life. It's a place where the laws of physics bend, where space-time itself is twisted into something far more mutable, and where the Eldar could travel quickly across the stars without stepping foot in the dangerous and unpredictable immaterium, the warp. In essence, the Webway was their shield and sword, allowing them to maneuver through the galaxy swiftly, out of sight of their enemies, and with unparalleled strategic advantage. At its height, the Webway was the foundation of Eldar civilization. It allowed the once great Eldar Empire to flourish, expanding far beyond the capabilities of any other race as they wove their vast networks across the galaxy. The Webway was essentially the backbone of their empire. It connected their homeworlds, their vast fleets, and their many craft worlds, making them one of the most formidable and advanced species to have ever lived. The Webway wasn't just a tool, it was a symbol of Eldar ingenuity, of a civilization at its peak, capable of shaping the universe to their will. But it wasn't just a marvel of technology, it was also a realm in itself. The Webway, while safe from the chaotic storms of the warp, was not devoid of dangers. It had its own inhabitants, strange creatures that prowled its infinite corridors, and it was a place where the Eldar encountered strange, almost mystical phenomena. For them, it was a realm that offered both sanctuary and peril. It was said that the heart of the Webway held secrets of unimaginable power, secrets that could bend the course of fate itself. To the Eldar, the Webway was everything. It was their most valuable possession, their greatest strength, and their ultimate means of survival. However, as we know, all things eventually come to an end. The rise of the Chaos Gods, the unfolding of the Fall, and the cataclysmic collapse of their empire would challenge everything the Eldar had built, including their precious Webway. But for now, at the height of their power, the Webway was the pinnacle of their achievements. It was the very spine of their empire, and without it, the Eldar would not have been the unstoppable force they once were. The Eldar, once the pinnacle of galactic civilization, rose from the depths of time as a race of incomparable grace, intellect, and sophistication. Imagine a species whose technological prowess surpassed anything the galaxy had ever seen, their culture a blend of philosophy, art, and science so advanced that it seemed almost divine. At their height, the Eldar were the galaxy's shining beacon, a race that had transcended the very limitations of the material universe. The galaxy was their canvas, and they were the master artists, sculpting worlds and stars to fit their will. Their mastery of the Webway, that vast network of hidden, dimension-bending corridors, was just one example of their superior understanding of the universe. The Eldar weren't just using technology, they were shaping it, bending it to their will with a finesse that bordered on the supernatural. To them, the universe was a realm to be understood and controlled, not feared. Their ships, sleek and elegant, cut through the void with the speed and precision of a master swordsman, and their cities, sprawling and beautiful, were architectural marvels that blended seamlessly with the natural beauty of the worlds they inhabited. But the Eldar were more than just skilled engineers and artists. They were a race deeply connected to the very fabric of the universe itself, attuned to its rhythms in a way that no other species could even begin to comprehend. The Eldar had achieved what seemed like perfection, a state where every individual was an expression of their race's collective potential. They were long-lived, their minds sharp and clear, their bodies honed to peak physical condition. Their society was built on a foundation of knowledge and wisdom, with each member contributing to the greater whole, whether through artistry, science, or philosophy. Yet, despite all their achievements, there was an underlying tension within Eldar society. This golden age, for all its brilliance, was not without its flaws. Beneath the surface of their intellectual and cultural prosperity, there simmered a sense of complacency, even arrogance. The Eldar were so advanced, so confident in their superiority, that they began to indulge in their own excesses. The pursuit of pleasure, the craving for more, these things began to overshadow their once pristine values. It is said that their culture became a breeding ground for decadence, where the pursuit of sensory experiences, of indulgence in every form, became a cornerstone of their society. But what started as a way to celebrate life and beauty soon twisted into something darker, something more dangerous. It's easy to look at the Eldar in their prime and think that their downfall was inevitable. After all, they had everything: technology, art, beauty, power, and knowledge beyond measure. But their greatest strength became their undoing. They were so sure of their place in the universe, so consumed by their own brilliance, that they failed to see the creeping danger lurking just beyond their own perception. The rise of Slaanesh, the chaos god of excess and hedonism, was the consequence of the Eldar's overindulgence. It wasn't just the birth of a new chaos entity, it was the culmination of everything the Eldar had allowed to fester within their own society. Their hedonism, their search for ever greater pleasures, gave birth to Slaanesh, and with it, the destruction of everything they had built. The birth of Slaanesh wasn't a singular event, it was a cataclysm, a rupture in reality itself. The shockwave from Slaanesh's birth spread like wildfire, engulfing the Eldar Empire in a tidal wave of madness, corruption, and death. Whole worlds were consumed, their inhabitants torn apart by the sheer force of the emerging chaos god. The Eldar, once the masters of the universe, were reduced to mere pawns in a game of cosmic destruction. Their once pristine empire collapsed in a matter of moments, leaving behind nothing but ruins and broken dreams. This tragic fall of the Eldar is something that has captivated fans for generations. There's a certain tragic beauty to it, the way their pride, their unshakable belief in their own superiority, led them to their destruction. Some fans argue that the Eldar were always doomed to fall, that their overreaching nature would eventually lead them to the precipice of their own demise. Others suggest that, had the Eldar been more cautious, more self-aware, they could have avoided the cataclysm altogether. But regardless of how one views their downfall, it is clear that the Eldar's peak was as dazzling as it was fleeting. And yet, even in the ashes of their civilization, the Eldar's legacy endures. Their technology, their art, their knowledge, all of it remains, a reminder of what once was. But as we'll see, the Eldar were not completely wiped from existence. There were those who survived, those who fled the devastation, and those who would rebuild, albeit in a different form. The story of the Eldar is not one of complete destruction, but rather one of loss and survival. They may have fallen, but they are not gone. The remnants of their glory still echo through the stars, a tragic reminder of what happens when perfection gives way to excess. The birth of the Chaos Gods is one of the most catastrophic and, in many ways, tragic events in the history of the galaxy. It's an origin story steeped in excess, darkness, and the inevitable consequences of the Eldar's own decadence. Chaos itself was not simply a force of destruction. It was birthed from the very hearts and minds of the most powerful and corrupt emotions within the galaxy. In a way, the Chaos Gods are the personifications of the worst, excesses, and most primal urges that dwell deep within all beings. And the Eldar, in their infinite arrogance, had unwittingly nurtured them, fed them, and unleashed them upon the universe. The story begins with the Eldar, who, at the height of their empire, became enslaved to their desires. They sought not just knowledge and beauty, but pleasure in all forms, pushing every experience to its absolute limits. For them, there was no such thing as moderation, no limits to the sensations they sought. Every indulgence, every orgy of sensory delight, every act of hedonism fed a growing hunger, a hunger that would eventually give birth to something far more terrible than they could ever have imagined. The Eldar were too consumed by their pursuit of excess to realize that the very forces they had been dabbling with were slowly gathering shape, like a storm cloud that had been brewing without their notice. The Chaos Gods, as we now know them, are four primordial entities, each born from a specific aspect of emotion or desire. There is Khorne, the bloodthirsty god of war and violence, born from the endless desire for conquest, power, and destruction. Then there's Tzeentch, the god of change and manipulation, a being who embodies the hunger for power through deception, the craving for the unpredictable twists of fate. Nurgle, the plague god, embodies decay, rot, and stagnation, the dark desire for eternal life and the twisted acceptance of mortality and suffering. And finally, there is Slaanesh, the most dangerous and direct reflection of the Eldar's own fall, the god of excess, lust, and hedonism, born from the overindulgence that had taken root in Eldar society. What is truly fascinating and in many ways disturbing is how these beings were not created by an external force, but rather by the collective thoughts, actions, and desires of countless sentient beings across the galaxy. They are not simply gods, they are the embodiment of the very worst aspects of sentient existence. Chaos was an inevitable consequence of the Eldar's actions, but it wasn't their sole responsibility. These gods arose from the darkest corners of the galaxy, where every race and every soul contributed to their growth. And when they were born, it wasn't like a simple appearance of divine beings from some cosmic plane. It was a cataclysmic event. The birth of Slaanesh, in particular, is said to have been so intense that it shook the very fabric of the galaxy itself. The Eldar, who had been reveling in their own self-destruction, were the first to suffer from the birth of the Chaos Gods. Slaanesh, in particular, was the most direct consequence of their decadence. This god of excess tore through the Eldar's very souls, consuming them in waves of unimaginable pleasure and pain. Entire craft worlds were destroyed in an instant, their people caught in the throes of a maddening ecstasy that broke their minds and shattered their bodies. The universe itself was thrown into chaos as the emergence of the Chaos Gods destabilized the fabric of reality. The Eldar, once the mightiest of races, were left helpless in the wake of their own actions, powerless to stop the wrath that they had unleashed. But what makes this even more tragic is the fact that the Eldar were not entirely unaware of the consequences of their indulgence. Some among them foresaw the coming storm, and in the final moments before the birth of the Chaos Gods, they tried to take action. They attempted to flee, to hide within the Webway, where they could escape the storm of chaos and survive. But the birth of Slaanesh was so powerful, so all-encompassing, that even the Webway could not protect them. The birth of the Chaos Gods was an event so vast and all-consuming that it engulfed even the Eldar's most secure sanctuaries. And while the Eldar's fall is the most obvious consequence of the birth of the Chaos Gods, the reality is that the entire galaxy was affected. The birth of these gods unleashed a wave of destruction that affected every race, every civilization, and every species in the galaxy. The fabric of reality itself began to fray as the warp, the realm of chaos and madness, bled into the material world. The consequences were far-reaching, and they are still felt today. Even now, the Chaos Gods continue to influence the galaxy, sowing discord, spreading chaos, and corrupting the hearts of those who fall prey to their power. Fans of the Warhammer 40K universe often speculate on what could have been. Some wonder whether the Eldar's downfall was truly inevitable, given their excessive nature. Others argue that if the Eldar had been more cautious, if they had recognized the dangers of their own indulgences, they could have avoided this catastrophe. But the truth is, we will never know. The birth of the Chaos Gods was a turning point in the galaxy's history, and it is a story that remains in many ways shrouded in mystery. Perhaps the most unsettling part of this tale is the realization that the Chaos Gods are not just gods of destruction and malevolence. They are also reflections of the very worst aspects of ourselves. They are the embodiment of greed, lust, pride, and violence. They are the dark mirror of every sentient being's deepest desires and fears. In a way, the Chaos Gods are not just the Eldar's curse, they are the galaxy's curse. Every race, every civilization has in some way contributed to their creation, and now every race must deal with the consequences. The birth of the Chaos Gods may have been the Eldar's undoing, but it is a cosmic tragedy that affects us all. When the Eldar finally realized the extent of the threat they had unwittingly unleashed upon the galaxy, their first response was a mix of disbelief, regret, and desperate urgency. The birth of the Chaos Gods, particularly Slaanesh, shook the Eldar to their very core. In their hubris and arrogance, they had thought themselves invincible, masters of the universe, but now they were witnessing their civilization crumble before their very eyes. What followed was not a moment of sudden insight or immediate action, but rather a frantic scramble to salvage what they could from the devastation they had wrought. The first and most immediate reaction of the Eldar was, unsurprisingly, to flee. They tried to retreat into the Webway, that network of hidden pathways that had always been their refuge from the horrors of the universe. The Webway was their lifeline, their escape hatch from the inevitable fallout of their own excesses. But this was no ordinary retreat. It was a last-ditch effort to preserve the very heart of their civilization. The Webway was not simply a place to hide. It was the foundation of their empire, the interconnected veins of their technological and cultural strength. Without it, the Eldar had nothing. Yet, despite their best efforts, the birth of Slaanesh had tainted the Webway as well, corrupting it with the chaos that now spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The once stable, reliable network was now a fractured, unstable place, a shadow of its former self. The Eldar could no longer rely on it to save them. This first response was marked by an overwhelming sense of panic. It wasn't a strategic retreat. It was more like a frantic scramble for survival. The once proud Eldar, who had once controlled the stars, were now reduced to desperate refugees, fleeing from the very thing they had created. They had failed to recognize the danger in their own hedonistic excesses, and now they were paying the price. The Webway, once their greatest strength, was now an unreliable refuge, tainted by the very forces they had helped to create. But this wasn't the only attempt the Eldar made to save themselves. Realizing that the Webway alone would not be enough to protect them from the cosmic forces unleashed by Slaanesh, the Eldar turned to more drastic measures. The most famous of these attempts was the creation of the craft worlds. These massive, self-contained spaceships were designed to carry the surviving Eldar away from the dying worlds, a final refuge for their species. The craft worlds were more than just ships. They were mobile sanctuaries, floating citadels that held the remnants of the Eldar race. They were the last bastions of hope for a people facing extinction. But even the craft worlds were not immune to the chaos that had been unleashed. The first battles fought in the Webway, as the Eldar desperately tried to escape the wrath of Slaanesh, were horrific. Entire craft worlds were lost in the early days of the war in the Webway. The once proud fleets, filled with Eldar warriors and scholars, were torn apart by the very forces they had once mastered. The Eldar tried to fight back against the Chaos Gods, but they were facing an enemy that they had never encountered before, an enemy born from their own excesses. They were fighting not just against the physical forces of chaos, but against the very emotions and desires that had birthed it. It was as if they were trying to fight themselves. This is where the true tragedy of the Eldar's response becomes clear. The Eldar, at their peak, had been the masters of technology and strategy. They were unmatched in every aspect of warfare. Yet, when it came to the Chaos Gods, they were helpless. They were fighting against something that could not be reasoned with, something that had no rules, no strategy, no boundaries. The Chaos Gods were not just a physical threat, they were a spiritual one, an existential one. And the Eldar, with all their might, could not escape the consequences of their own hubris. There are many theories about what the Eldar could have done differently. Some fans believe that had the Eldar recognized the dangers of their own decadence earlier, they could have prevented the birth of Slaanesh and the chaos that followed. Others argue that the very nature of the Eldar, their pursuit of perfection and excess, made such an outcome inevitable. The birth of Slaanesh wasn't just the result of a few bad choices, it was the culmination of millennia of self-destructive behavior, a slow spiral that the Eldar never realized they were caught in until it was too late. And what of the survivors of this cataclysm? What happened to those who managed to escape the wrath of Slaanesh, those who found refuge in the craft worlds? For them, the war against chaos didn't end with the fall of their empire. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new chapter of suffering and survival. The craft worlds became floating tombs, vessels of memory and loss, where the Eldar would struggle to hold on to their culture, their identity, and their future. The survivors were left to rebuild what had been lost, but they knew that their civilization was forever changed. The war in the Webway, the failed attempt to stop the birth of Slaanesh, was a chapter that would haunt them for eternity. The tragic irony here is that the Eldar, in their pursuit of perfection, had become the architects of their own downfall. Their attempt to fight back against the Chaos Gods, their frantic efforts to survive, were all rooted in their own mistakes. The birth of Slaanesh wasn't just a cosmic disaster, it was a reflection of everything the Eldar had become. A race so obsessed with their own superiority, so consumed by their own desires, that they failed to see the darkness creeping up on them. It's a bitter, tragic truth, one that even the most loyal Eldar must come to terms with. And as we look back on the Eldar's first response to the growing threat of chaos, we're left with one unavoidable conclusion. They were doomed from the start. They had pushed the limits of their power. Their civilization had grown too decadent, too self-absorbed, and in the end, they could not escape the consequences of their own actions. Their first response was a desperate, doomed attempt to salvage what they could, but it was too little, too late. And so the Eldar's fall became inevitable, a tragic story of excess, arrogance, and the eventual collapse of a once great civilization. The decision to fight back within the Webway was a choice born of desperation, a last-ditch attempt by the Eldar to reclaim their civilization from the horrors they had unwittingly unleashed. When the true extent of the chaos, birthed by their excesses, became clear, the Eldar knew they had no choice but to turn to the very place that had once been their refuge, the Webway. It wasn't just a place of travel, it was the heart of their empire, the secret veins of the Eldar race. The Webway had always been a place of safety, a hidden dimension where they could move without the fear of being discovered by their enemies. Now it would become the last battleground of their struggle for survival. But the Eldar weren't simply retreating into the Webway. They were preparing for war. The birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent chaos had unleashed a flood of madness, and the Eldar knew that if they didn't take action, they would be wiped out entirely. The Webway was their final refuge, but it had also become a battleground. The decision to fight back was not a simple one. It required immense sacrifice, tremendous risk, and the willingness to confront a force far beyond their understanding. To many, it was a desperate move, and the consequences were far-reaching. Yet, for the Eldar, it was the only option left. The strategy behind the war in the Webway was, in many ways, a gamble, a last, desperate attempt to reclaim what had been lost. It wasn't just about surviving the onslaught of chaos. It was about trying to prevent the complete collapse of their empire. The Eldar realized that they had no other choice but to confront the Chaos Gods on their own terms, and the only place where this confrontation could take place was within the Webway, that hidden dimension where reality itself was more malleable. To fight in the Webway was to fight in a realm of possibility, a place where the laws of physics and time could be bent to the will of those who understood it. But this was no ordinary battle. The Eldar didn't simply march into the Webway with a plan to fight. They were entering a place that was as dangerous as it was familiar. The Webway was not a static space. It was a shifting, unstable realm, a labyrinth of tunnels and corridors that could change at a moment's notice. Even the Eldar, with their advanced technology and unmatched knowledge, couldn't fully control it. The Webway was a place of constant flux, and it was there, in that unpredictable environment, that the Eldar would face the full force of chaos. For the Eldar, the decision to fight within the Webway was both a tactical necessity and a philosophical one. It was a place of power, a place where they could potentially harness the very energies that had led to their downfall. Some of the greatest minds among the Eldar, the Seers and Psychers who had foreseen the birth of Slaanesh, believed that the Webway was the key to preventing the complete collapse of their race. They saw the Webway as a battleground not just against chaos, but against their own failures, their own excesses. It was a place where they could, in theory, reclaim the power that they had once had, but only at great cost. The plan to fight back was not without its flaws. The Eldar were not unified in their approach. There were factions within their race that saw different solutions to the problem at hand. Some believed that they could seal off the Webway entirely, retreating into its depths and hiding from the chaos that had overtaken the galaxy. Others, more radical in their thinking, argued that the only way to stop chaos was to confront it head-on, to use the very power of the Webway to trap the forces of chaos within it. But such a plan was not without its dangers. The power of the Chaos Gods was vast, and the Webway, for all its potential, was an unpredictable force. One of the most controversial ideas among the Eldar during this time was the creation of the Black Library. Hidden deep within the Webway, this library contained knowledge that was forbidden even to the Eldar. It was a place where the darkest secrets of their race were kept, where the most forbidden arts of the Eldar psyche were stored. The Black Library was a desperate attempt to collect and preserve the knowledge that could defeat chaos, but it was also a place of immense danger. The Eldar knew that if the Chaos Gods ever gained access to the Black Library, they could destroy the last hope of the Eldar once and for all. And yet, despite the risks, the Eldar continued their work, hoping that the knowledge contained within would one day give them the strength to fight back. As the war in the Webway unfolded, it became clear that the Eldar were not just fighting for their survival. They were fighting to preserve their very identity. The Webway was a reflection of their empire, a place that held the essence of who they were. It was a place where their greatest achievements and their darkest secrets were interwoven. The Eldar knew that to lose the Webway was to lose everything. It was not just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the soul of their civilization. The consequences of the war in the Webway were profound. For some, it marked the beginning of a long period of decline, a realization that the Eldar were not invincible, that their past mistakes had caught up with them. For others, it was a rallying cry, a call to arms to protect what was left of their race and to fight for the future. The war in the Webway was the defining moment in the Eldar struggle against the forces of chaos, but it was also the beginning of their transformation. They would never be the same again. The Eldar that emerged from the Webway, scarred and broken, were a shadow of the civilization that had once ruled the stars. Some fans speculate that if the Eldar had acted earlier, if they had realized the danger of their own actions before it was too late, they could have avoided the war entirely. But the truth is that the war in the Webway, for all its tragedy, was the inevitable consequence of the Eldar's pride. They had overreached, indulged in their own excesses, and now they were paying the price. In the end, the Webway was their last desperate hope, but it was also a reminder of their greatest failure, a failure that would haunt them for all eternity. The Eldar's attempt to survive after the birth of Slaanesh and the ensuing collapse of their once great empire is marked by a series of catastrophic mistakes, strategic miscalculations, and missed opportunities that led to their inevitable decline. The war in the Webway, which they had hoped would be their salvation, ultimately became a symbol of their failure, a desperate, fragmented response to a threat that was far greater than they had ever truly understood. One of the key failures of the Eldar in their attempt to survive was their underestimation of the full scale of the threat posed by the Chaos Gods. At the outset, there was a sense of optimism among certain factions of Eldar leadership, particularly the Seers and the Farseers, who believed that the war in the Webway could be won, that it could be contained, and that the Eldar might yet regain control over their fate. This hubris blinded them to the vast power of Slaanesh and the Chaos Gods. It wasn't just the Eldar's pride that led to their downfall, it was their failure to recognize the immensity of what they had unleashed. The birth of Slaanesh was not a simple event. It was a cosmic upheaval that shattered the very fabric of the galaxy. The Eldar, despite their impressive intellect and advanced technology, were playing a game against forces that they could not comprehend. And this misunderstanding would be the seed of their undoing. Strategically, the Eldar's response to the crisis was fragmented and disorganized. As the Chaos Gods rose to power, the Eldar were forced to scatter, retreating into the Webway, abandoning whole sectors of their empire. But in their haste, they did not make the necessary preparations for the long-term survival of their race. The creation of the craft worlds, while an admirable attempt to save the remnants of their civilization, came too late. It was a reactive measure, not a proactive one. The craft worlds were massive, self-contained ships that carried the last of the Eldar people away from the chaos, but they were not invulnerable. They were not equipped to fight the tide of chaos that was sweeping through the galaxy. They were mobile sanctuaries, but they were far from perfect. The Webway itself was a dangerous place, torn apart by the very forces that the Eldar had sought to control. The craft worlds, while a symbol of their resilience, were also a reminder of their failure to prepare properly for the cataclysm that was unfolding. Even more crucial was the failure of the Eldar's leadership to come together in unity. There were factions within the Eldar race, divided by politics, by differing ideologies, and by personal ambitions, that struggled to find a common purpose in the face of the coming destruction. Some factions, such as the Exodites, believed that the Eldar could survive by abandoning their old ways and returning to a simpler, more nature-focused existence. Others, like the Drukhari, chose to embrace the chaos, carving out a new existence in the dark corners of the galaxy. But none of these factions could agree on a singular, cohesive plan to address the growing threat of chaos. This lack of unity, this constant bickering and infighting, meant that the Eldar were never able to mount a truly coordinated response to the war in the Webway. In the face of a threat that could have destroyed them all, they remained divided, each faction fighting for their own survival rather than for the survival of their species as a whole. The decision to fight the war in the Webway itself was a flawed one, and this became apparent as the conflict dragged on. The Webway, once a place of safety, had been corrupted by the birth of Slaanesh. As the Eldar fought their battles within its shifting corridors, they found that the very environment they had hoped would protect them was now working against them. The Webway, with its ever-changing passages and unpredictable nature, became a labyrinth of death, a maze that the Eldar could not navigate. They had thought they could control the Webway, that it would be their refuge, but it became their tomb. Some fans argue that had the Eldar focused their efforts on rebuilding their empire outside of the Webway, they might have had a better chance of surviving. Others, however, believed that the Webway was their only hope, and that no matter where they had gone, their fate was sealed the moment Slaanesh was born. One of the most tragic aspects of the war in the Webway was the loss of the Eldar's greatest minds. In their panic, in their frantic rush to secure their survival, the Eldar lost touch with the very thing that had once made them the dominant force in the galaxy, their intellectual and cultural brilliance. The Eldar had been a race of thinkers, philosophers, and artists, but as the war progressed, many of these great minds were lost to the chaos. The war turned the Eldar into mere survivors, fighting not for progress or knowledge, but for their own existence. It's said that the very essence of Eldar culture was destroyed in the Webway. What was once a race of creators, philosophers, and artists had become a race of refugees, wandering the labyrinthine corridors, trying to stay one step ahead of the chaos forces that sought to destroy them. The loss of these intellectual giants was, in many ways, the death of the Eldar as a truly advanced civilization. Without their scholars, their seers, and their artists, the Eldar were reduced to mere survivors, clinging to life in the wake of their destruction. In hindsight, many fans of the lore speculate about what could have been done differently. Could the Eldar have seen the rise of Slaanesh coming? Could they have acted sooner, more decisively, to prevent the catastrophe? The answer, of course, is no. The Eldar were victims of their own hubris, their own inability to see the consequences of their actions. They believed that they were masters of the universe, that their technological and intellectual superiority would protect them from the consequences of their excesses. But they were wrong. The Chaos Gods were beyond their understanding, and the war in the Webway was the result of a species that had overreached, that had indulged in pleasures without considering the cost. The Eldar's failed attempt at survival is a tragic story of a race that had everything but lost it all through a combination of arrogance, overconfidence, and a lack of unity. The Webway, which had once been their greatest strength, became their greatest weakness. The craft worlds, which had been their last hope, were too late, too isolated, and too vulnerable. And in the end, the Eldar were forced to live with the consequences of their own choices, forever haunted by the ghosts of what they had once been. The war in the Webway was not just a failure to survive, it was the death of an empire, the end of a civilization that had once stood at the pinnacle of the galaxy. Amidst the wreckage of a fallen civilization, as the Eldar scattered across the stars in their self-imposed exile, there was a group that took a dark and twisted path in their desperate struggle for survival. The Drukhari, or Dark Eldar as they are sometimes called, were born from the ashes of their ancestors' downfall, shaped by a combination of ruthless necessity and sheer malice. Their emergence is one of the most tragic yet fascinating stories in the Warhammer 40k universe. They are a people forged from the darkest depths of Eldar society, an offshoot, a perverse reflection of the grandeur that once was, a race born of suffering and vengeance. To understand the Drukhari's rise, we must first look at the moment when the Eldar's empire collapsed under the weight of their own excess. The birth of Slaanesh, born from the Eldar's indulgence in decadence and hedonism, had shattered the very fabric of their existence. The birth of the Chaos God was not just a cosmic disaster, it was a cataclysmic rift that tore apart the Eldar people, leaving the galaxy in ruins. Whole sectors of their empire were destroyed, their once great cities and craft worlds consumed by the birth of Slaanesh, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. And yet, not all Eldar were lost. Some, as we know, survived, those who turned to the Webway, the last sanctuary they had left, and those who chose a darker, more insidious path. The Drukhari are the result of this path, a faction of the Eldar who chose to embrace the chaos of their situation and use it to their advantage. When the birth of Slaanesh tore through their society, some Eldar saw an opportunity. They did not retreat into the Webway in search of salvation. Instead, they turned to it as a weapon, seeking to harness its power for themselves. The Webway, which had once been a tool for travel and communication, became the playground of these new Dark Masters. These Eldar, who had once been noble and refined, now embraced the darkest aspects of their nature. They found a way to survive not by hiding, but by feeding off the suffering and torment of others. The Drukhari's survival depended on their willingness to commit unspeakable acts. The agony and suffering they inflicted on others became the source of their strength. They perfected the art of torture, their societies built on a foundation of pain and misery. Their dark citadels, most notably the infamous city of Kalmarah, became labyrinths of torment, where the weak were preyed upon and the strong thrived on the suffering of others. In this hellish reflection of their former civilization, the Drukhari emerged as a new power in the galaxy, with no qualms about their methods or their goals. The Webway, which had once been a place of refuge, became their weapon of terror, a realm of nightmares where they could rule without mercy or restraint. What makes the Drukhari so terrifying is not just their cruelty, but the fact that they are a reflection of what the Eldar could have become had they fully embraced their darker impulses. The Drukhari are not some aberration. They are the inevitable consequence of the Eldar's descent into decadence and excess. Fans of the lore often debate whether the Drukhari are merely a twisted version of their ancestors, or whether they represent a true breaking point in the Eldar psyche. Some believe that the Drukhari were always lurking beneath the surface of Eldar society, a reflection of the darker aspects of their race. Others argue that the rise of the Drukhari represents a complete abandonment of the Eldar's noble ideals, a fall from grace so complete that it left no trace of their former glory. But the Drukhari are not simply a result of Slaaneş's birth. They are the product of the Eldar's own decisions. They chose to embrace pain and suffering as a way of life. They reveled in their cruelty, finding pleasure in the destruction of others. They did not seek redemption, nor did they attempt to repair the damage caused by their indulgences. Instead, they embraced the darkness, feeding on it and using it to grow stronger. In a way, they represent the ultimate failure of the Eldar society. The Eldar, in their pursuit of perfection, had created a monster, not a literal one, but a race that thrived on the very suffering that had led to their own downfall. The role of the Drukhari in the war in the Webway is often overlooked by those who focus solely on the tragic fall of the Eldar. The Drukhari didn't just survive the conflict, they played an active part in it. They were not passive victims of Slaaneş's birth. They were opportunists, seizing the chaos and using it to their advantage. Their role in the conflict within the Webway was one of darkness and cunning, as they manipulated the situation to further their own goals. While the Eldar fought to preserve their way of life, the Drukhari were carving out their own empire in the very heart of their ruined civilization. Their emergence as a separate faction was marked by a complete rejection of the ideals that had once defined the Eldar. The Drukhari rejected the pursuit of knowledge, art, and enlightenment in favor of self-serving cruelty and decadence. They became the embodiment of the very excess that had doomed their race. But in doing so, they created something entirely new, a faction of Eldar who were not bound by the same moral constraints as their ancestors. The Drukhari were not just survivors, they were predators, and they would stop at nothing to maintain their power. In the Webway, the Drukhari found a refuge, a place where they could rule with impunity. Kalmarah became their home, a city of endless suffering and torment, where they thrived on the fear and agony of others. The Webway itself became their playground, a dimension where they could manipulate the flow of time and space to suit their needs. They didn't just survive. They thrived in the chaos, using it as a weapon to bend the universe to their will. Some fans argue that the Drukhari are a tragic reflection of what the Eldar could have become if they had given in to their darkest desires. Others see them as a necessary evil, a part of the galaxy's tapestry that exists because of the choices made by their ancestors. The Drukhari are a twisted, horrifying version of the Eldar, but they are also a reminder of the dangers of unchecked indulgence, of the consequences of embracing the darkness within. They are the ultimate lesson of the Eldar's fall, one that the galaxy will never forget. The Drukhari, born from the ashes of the Eldar civilization, are both a testament to their downfall and a reflection of the galaxy's darkest corners. The Webway was never meant to be a battleground. It was meant to be a place of escape, a realm of safety and refuge for the Eldar, away from the dangers of the material universe. But when the forces of chaos, particularly the devastating birth of Slaanesh, began to ravage the Eldar civilization, the Webway became their final line of defense. And it wasn't long before the once-hidden corridors became a brutal, violent battlefield where the Eldar fought not just for survival, but for the very soul of their race. The battles fought within the Webway were some of the most significant and tragic in Eldar history, determining the fate of the Eldar people and shaping the course of the galaxy. The first major conflict within the Webway was an act of desperation. As the birth of Slaanesh tore apart their civilization, the Eldar realized that the Webway, which had been their refuge, was now their battleground. They were no longer able to escape the growing chaos that threatened to consume them. With the Chaos Gods now unleashed and Slaanesh's influence spreading across the galaxy, the Eldar had no choice but to fight back, retreating into the very Webway they had once used for safe passage. It was here that the first battles were fought, where Eldar warriors, led by their greatest commanders and seers, took up arms to defend the sacred halls of the Webway from the forces of chaos. However, these battles were far from easy. The Webway was not a traditional battlefield. It was a labyrinth of shifting, unpredictable corridors, a place where the very laws of reality could bend and warp at a moment's notice. The Eldar, who had once been masters of technology and strategy, now found themselves struggling to control their environment. The Chaos forces, particularly the demons and other creatures of the warp, were not bound by the same rules of reality. They could warp the Webway itself, turning its passageways into treacherous traps, distorting space and time in ways the Eldar could not fully understand. It was in this alien environment that the true nature of the conflict emerged. The first major clash between the Eldar and the forces of chaos in the Webway was brutal. The Eldar fought valiantly, using their advanced technology and psychic powers to hold back the tide of chaos. But they were fighting a losing battle. The forces of Slaanesh, in particular, were relentless. The demons of Slaanesh, embodiments of excess, hedonism, and torment, swept through the Webway with an insatiable hunger, tearing apart everything in their path. It wasn't just a physical battle, it was a spiritual one, a war fought against the very essence of their civilization. The Eldar, for the first time, were forced to confront not just an enemy of flesh and bone, but an enemy of their own making, a reflection of their own failings. What makes these Webway battles so significant and so tragic is that the Eldar were fighting against something they had created themselves. The birth of Slaanesh was the consequence of their indulgence in excess, their desire for perfection, and their pursuit of pleasure at all costs. Now they were facing the wrath of what they had unleashed, a dark reflection of their own society. The forces of Slaanesh were not just an external enemy. They were a manifestation of the Eldar's darkest desires, and fighting them meant confronting the very nature of their own existence. The Webway battles were, in a sense, a war for the Eldar's soul. As the conflict raged on, the Eldar's initial optimism began to fade. The Webway, which had once been their sanctuary, became a war zone. Eldar cities and fortresses that had been built within the Webway began to fall one by one, overwhelmed by the relentless assault of the Chaos forces. The craft worlds, which had been the Eldar's last hope, were not immune to the chaos either. Though they were safe in the material realm, the forces of chaos still sought to corrupt them, and some of the most influential craft worlds were eventually lost to the madness of the warp. The war, at least in the Webway, seemed like a futile struggle, one that could not be won. But in the midst of all this despair, the Eldar learned something that would ultimately shape their future. The battles within the Webway were not just a war for survival, they were a war for their very identity. As the conflict wore on, the Eldar began to realize that they were not fighting just to keep their race alive. They were fighting to preserve the ideals that had once defined them. They were fighting for their culture, their knowledge, and their place in the galaxy. And in the process, they began to understand something fundamental about themselves. The war in the Webway wasn't just about fighting chaos. It was about coming to terms with the consequences of their own actions. Fan theories often focus on the philosophical implications of the Webway conflict. Some believe that the Eldar's fight in the Webway symbolized their deep inner struggle, a battle not just against chaos, but against their own excesses and flaws. They had created Slaanesh, yes, but in doing so they had created a reflection of themselves, a twisted, dark mirror. To defeat Slaanesh, the Eldar had to defeat themselves, or at least confront the part of their race that had led them down this path. The Webway battles, then, were not just physical. They were symbolic of the Eldar's internal struggle, their grappling with guilt, remorse, and the price of their own hubris. Despite the strategic brilliance of the Eldar, the reality was that their enemies were simply too powerful. The Webway became a battleground where the Eldar's greatest warriors and leaders fell one by one, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of Chaos's power. And in the end, it was not a victory of arms that would save the Eldar. Instead, it was their retreat into the Webway's deepest recesses, their ultimate flight from the galaxy, that would mark the end of their struggle. The Webway, for all its significance, could not save them from the consequences of their own actions. The battles fought within the Webway, while significant, were only one chapter in the larger story of the Eldar's fall. They were a brief but brutal conflict in the shadow of an empire's collapse, and they would forever define the Eldar as a people caught between their past glory and their tragic future. The Webway would remain their prison and their refuge, a place where they would hide from the forces of chaos, but also a place where they would never truly be free. The wars fought within its walls were battles for survival, but ultimately, they were also battles for something far more elusive: redemption. The war in the Webway, though brief compared to the greater history of the Eldar, left an indelible mark on the psyche of the survivors. It was a battle not just for the survival of their race, but for the very essence of what it meant to be Eldar. The toll of that war went far beyond the loss of life, the destruction of cities, or the fall of entire craft worlds. It was a psychological and cultural wound that would leave scars lasting millennia. In the days before the birth of Slaanesh, the Eldar were a people whose identity was defined by their pursuit of knowledge, art, and the refinement of their existence. They were a society that valued beauty, intellect, and a deep connection to the universe. But that pursuit, that hunger for perfection, had taken them down a path of excess, indulgence, and eventual damnation. The birth of Slaanesh marked the beginning of a long, slow collapse, and the war in the Webway was the final, devastating chapter in that downfall. It was an era where the Eldar's brightest minds, their greatest warriors, and their most esteemed leaders were consumed by the chaotic maelstrom of their own creation. To fight within the Webway was to fight against something that wasn't just an external enemy. It was a manifestation of their own self-destructive tendencies. The toll this war took on the Eldar was not just physical. Yes, countless warriors perished in the conflicts that racked the Webway, but the true cost was psychological. The Eldar had always prided themselves on their control, their ability to keep their emotions in check, and their intellectual superiority over the lesser races. But in the face of chaos, they were helpless. The realization that the forces they had so arrogantly dismissed as lesser were now overwhelming them with sheer power and malice struck at the very core of the Eldar identity. The war became a brutal confrontation with the Eldar's own darkest impulses, forcing them to confront the consequences of their hedonistic past. For those who survived the war in the Webway, the experience was a profound and disorienting one. Many Eldar who had once been the finest warriors and brightest minds of their race now found themselves lost, broken by the horrors they had witnessed. They had seen their civilization destroyed by their own failings, and they had failed in their last, desperate attempt to save it. The survivors were left with a deep sense of guilt, regret, and hopelessness. They knew that they had brought this destruction upon themselves, and that knowledge gnawed at them like a festering wound. The Eldar, once the pinnacle of civilization, were now reduced to a fractured, disillusioned people, struggling to hold on to their past glory while staring into the abyss of their own failures. The psychological toll was not limited to the warriors and leaders who fought in the Webway. It seeped into the very fabric of Eldar society. The Eldar had once been united by a sense of shared purpose, by the idea that they were the chosen of the universe, the most refined and advanced species in existence. But after the war in the Webway, that sense of unity shattered. The survivors were left with a fractured identity, unable to reconcile their past with the harsh reality they now faced. Some sought refuge in the craft worlds, retreating into isolation and self-preservation, while others, like the Drukhari, embraced the chaos and darkness that had taken root in their hearts. The Eldar were no longer a unified race, but a collection of broken factions, each one struggling to find meaning in the wake of their civilization's collapse. The loss of their once proud empire left the Eldar with a profound sense of grief and loss. It wasn't just the physical destruction of their worlds that affected them. It was the loss of their very identity. They had once been a race that saw themselves as the masters of the universe, but now they were survivors, clinging to the remnants of a world that no longer existed. This sense of loss permeated every aspect of their society, from their art and culture to their military and spiritual practices. They were no longer the same people who had once shaped the galaxy with their brilliance. They had been irrevocably changed, scarred by the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. For many Eldar, the war in the Webway marked the point at which they realized that their race could never return to its former glory. There would be no grand rebirth, no return to the Age of Enlightenment. The war had shown them that the forces they had once controlled had now consumed them, and that the galaxy was a far darker and more dangerous place than they had ever imagined. They were no longer the masters of the universe. They were mere survivors, fighting to maintain some semblance of their former identity in the face of overwhelming odds. The long-term survival of the Eldar was forever altered by the war in the Webway. It was not just a war for their physical existence. It was a war for the soul of their race. The psychological toll of that war would echo through the generations, shaping the future of the Eldar for millennia to come. The survivors of the Webway conflict carried the weight of their race's mistakes on their shoulders, knowing that their actions had led to the creation of Slaanesh and the downfall of their empire. It is said that the craft worlds, which became the last refuge of the Eldar, were not just sanctuaries. They were places of mourning, places where the Eldar could grieve for what they had lost and reflect on the lessons they had failed to learn. Fans of the lore often debate the psychological impact of the war in the Webway on the Eldar psyche. Some suggest that the Eldar survival was the beginning of a slow, painful process of healing and redemption, where they would learn to atone for the mistakes of their past and rebuild their civilization. Others argue that the war left the Eldar with a permanent scar, a wound that could never fully heal. The loss of their empire, their culture, and their identity was too great to overcome. The Eldar, in the end, would never be the same. For the Drukhari, the survivors who embraced the darkness, the war in the Webway was a turning point, a moment where they rejected the pain and grief that had consumed their people and chose to embrace their darker nature. They found strength in the suffering of others, using the agony of the weak as a means of survival. In this way, the Drukhari became a symbol of the Eldar's psychological trauma, an embodiment of the horrors they had suffered and the path they had taken to survive. For them, there was no redemption, no reconciliation with the past. There was only the cold, unrelenting hunger for power and domination. As for the craft world Eldar, they carry the burden of the war in the Webway with them wherever they go. The memories of those dark days are etched into their collective consciousness, a reminder of what they lost and what they are fighting to preserve. The war left them broken, but it also gave them a new sense of purpose, to survive, to protect what is left of their race, and to never forget the lessons learned in the crucible of their own destruction. The toll of the war in the Webway was heavy, but it was not the end of the Eldar. It was, however, the beginning of a new chapter in their tragic history. The aftermath of the war in the Webway was a time of ruin, reflection, and above all, survival. The Eldar had been utterly shattered, no longer the dominant, unchallenged race that had once controlled vast swathes of the galaxy. The birth of Slaanesh had devastated their empire, and the brutal battles in the Webway, while fierce and desperate, ultimately resulted in only one clear outcome: the fall of the Eldar. Yet, even in the face of this calamity, they did not simply vanish. The remnants of their civilization struggled to cling to existence as shattered fragments of their once great society splintered into different factions, each coping with the aftermath in their own way. The craft worlds, those massive, self-contained starships that had once served as sanctuaries, became the new heart of Eldar civilization. But these were no longer the brilliant, enlightened societies they had once been. The inhabitants of the craft worlds had witnessed the death of their people, the destruction of their empire, and the birth of a chaos god that had torn apart everything they had known. The survivors of the war, in the wake of such loss, were left with a deep and profound sense of grief and guilt, for they knew that they had created the very thing that had destroyed their civilization. In the aftermath of the war, the Eldar became a people defined not by the greatness of their past, but by the need to survive the consequences of their own actions. The craft world Eldar, then, became a people in mourning, clinging to the remnants of their former glory. Their society was no longer a beacon of perfection and beauty. It had become a fractured remnant, driven by a singular purpose: survival. The Webway, once a symbol of their technological superiority, had become a prison for their people. It was a place where their history, once filled with dreams of grandeur, was now just a grim reminder of their downfall. The craft worlds became sanctuaries not just from the dangers of the galaxy, but from the horrors of their past, and the Eldar who lived within them were haunted by the choices their race had made. In the years that followed, the Eldar began to rebuild, but their efforts were marked by a distinct sense of loss. The rise of Slaanesh had irrevocably altered their destiny, and while some Eldar sought to reclaim the glory of their past, others realized that the galaxy they had once ruled no longer existed. The craft worlds, isolated from the rest of the universe, became places of contemplation and, in some cases, self-doubt. They knew that they could never truly return to their former state of dominance. The galaxy had moved on, and the Eldar, for all their intelligence and grace, were no longer the masters of the stars. They had been humbled by the horrors they had unleashed, and that humbling was something that would shape their future forever. Yet, even in their struggle, the Eldar were not entirely defeated. They were a race of immense resilience, one that had faced catastrophe before and had risen from the ashes each time. The survivors, particularly those who had retreated into the craft worlds, began to focus not on regaining their lost glory, but on ensuring that their culture, their art, and their knowledge would survive. In the wake of the war, they sought to preserve their identity, knowing that without their cultural legacy, they would cease to be Eldar at all. The craft worlds became a repository of their history, their philosophies, and their greatest achievements. The Eldar turned inward, reflecting on their past sins and focusing on the things that had once made them great. But not all Eldar were content to remain within the craft worlds. As the millennia passed, new factions began to emerge, each with a different vision for the future of the Eldar race. The Drukhari, or Dark Eldar, were perhaps the most extreme of these factions. Born from the ashes of the Eldar's most decadent and cruel impulses, they embraced the darkness, thriving on the suffering of others. For the Drukhari, survival meant embracing their own corruption, finding strength in cruelty and power in the chaos that had destroyed their people. They became a shadow of their former selves, but in their own twisted way they were survivors who had rejected the ideals of their ancestors in favor of a brutal, self-serving existence. The rise of the Drukhari is one of the most tragic aspects of the Eldar's aftermath. They were not simply victims of the war in the Webway. They were willing participants in the decay of their own society. Their willingness to embrace the suffering of others, to indulge in the darkest aspects of their race, was a direct reflection of the failure of Eldar society as a whole. The Drukhari's rejection of the Eldar's former ideals was a rejection of the very things that had once made them great. But even in their cruelty, the Drukhari were a reminder of the Eldar's capacity for survival, however perverse that survival might have been. As for the rest of the Eldar, they turned to the stars once more, seeking to rebuild their race in whatever way they could. But they knew that the galaxy had changed, and so had they. The craft worlds became their safe haven, but they were not the invincible force they had once been. They were survivors, not rulers. And as they continued their struggle for survival, they faced a harsh truth. They would never reclaim the position of dominance they had once enjoyed. The galaxy had moved on, and the Eldar were no longer the central force they had once been. But even in their loss, the Eldar remained a force to be reckoned with. Some fans theorized that the Eldar's downfall was not inevitable, that had they acted sooner, had they been more cautious in their pursuit of pleasure and perfection, they could have avoided the disaster that led to the birth of Slaanesh. Others argue that the Eldar were simply too decadent, too self-absorbed, and that their fall was inevitable. Either way, the aftermath of the war in the Webway marked the beginning of a new era for the Eldar, one that would be defined by survival, by reflection, and by the constant struggle to maintain what little remained of their once great civilization. The Eldar were no longer the rulers of the galaxy. They were its exiles, forever haunted by the ghosts of their past mistakes. The fall of the Eldar is often seen as one of the greatest tragedies in the Warhammer 40K universe, but as with all things in this grimdark setting, there is no shortage of speculation and theory about what might have been. What if the Eldar had succeeded in their attempt to stop the birth of Slaanesh? What if they had recognized the danger of their hedonistic pursuits before it was too late? Theories about these alternative histories abound, and each one paints a picture of what could have been a very different future for the Eldar. Some fans argue that if the Eldar had acted earlier, if they had recognized the danger of their own excesses before Slaanesh's birth, they could have prevented the chaos that eventually destroyed them. If they had tempered their hedonism and turned away from the pursuit of excess, the Eldar might have avoided the birth of the Chaos God entirely. Imagine a galaxy where the Eldar, with their unmatched technology and vast knowledge, were still the dominant force. They could have continued their reign, expanding their influence and shaping the galaxy to their will. In this vision, the Eldar would have remained the masters of their fate. their civilization thriving in a world free of the destructive force that Slaanesh became. They could have continued their quest for knowledge and beauty, untainted by the chaos they had unleashed. Yet, this theory assumes that the Eldar were capable of such restraint. The reality, as many fans point out, is that the Eldar's downfall was not caused by a single act of indulgence, but by millennia of self-destructive behavior. The Eldar were a race that had always strived for perfection, and in their pursuit of that perfection, they had allowed their desires to grow unchecked. Their decadence was ingrained in their very culture. Even if they had realized the danger of their actions sooner, would they have truly been able to change? Could they have turned away from the very thing that had defined them for so long? The fact that Slaanesh emerged from their excesses suggests that perhaps it was always inevitable, that their downfall was baked into their very nature. Another theory that fans often discuss is the idea that the Eldar's downfall was not a failure at all, but rather an inevitable consequence of their own nature. The Eldar were always a race of extremes, driven by a constant desire for self-improvement and perfection. Their eventual collapse, some argue, was just the final result of their own excess. The birth of Slaanesh was not a mistake. It was the culmination of everything they had become. In this view, the Eldar's hedonistic pursuit of pleasure was not just a personal indulgence, but the natural extension of their culture. The Eldar had reached the peak of their civilization, but instead of using their power to transcend their desires, they had given in to them. They had become too powerful, too self-assured, and in doing so, they had created a force that was more than they could control. The birth of Slaanesh, in this sense, was the price they had to pay for their arrogance. Some fans believe that if the Eldar had succeeded in the war in the Webway and contained the forces of chaos, they would have eventually grown even more powerful. The Webway, as a dimension that could bend time and space, held the potential for unimaginable power. If the Eldar had learned to harness that power, they could have become a race that transcended physical limitations altogether, achieving a form of immortality that would have allowed them to rule the galaxy for eternity. The potential of the Webway is vast, and if the Eldar had unlocked its true power, they could have become godlike beings, far beyond the influence of the Chaos Gods. The idea of a universe where the Eldar remain supreme, untouched by the chaos that later ravaged the galaxy, is a tantalizing one for fans who see the Eldar as the true architects of the galaxy's fate. On the other hand, some fans argue that the Eldar's downfall was not just inevitable, but necessary. The birth of Slaanesh and the fall of the Eldar were a turning point in the galaxy's history, and without that event, the future would have been much darker. The Eldar, in their pursuit of perfection, had become complacent, ruling the galaxy without any true challenges to their dominance. The birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent chaos that followed served as a wake-up call to the galaxy. It broke the Eldar's hold over the stars and allowed other races to rise up. The Imperium of Man, for instance, could never have become the dominant power it is today without the fall of the Eldar. In this view, the Eldar's downfall was the necessary prelude to the rise of the Imperium, the Tau, and other factions. Some fans believe that the galaxy needed the Eldar to fall in order to allow for a new era of conflict and balance. The Eldar, as a race of near-godlike beings, were too powerful, and their fall paved the way for the rise of the forces of humanity. Still, others argue that the true tragedy of the Eldar's downfall lies in what they could have been had they chosen a different path. If the Eldar had turned away from excess and embraced a more balanced existence, they could have been the guiding force in the galaxy. They could have been the wise mentors to younger races, offering knowledge and wisdom to help prevent the rise of chaos and other threats. They were, after all, a race of immense intellect and power. Instead, they squandered that potential in the pursuit of self-indulgence. This, for many fans, is the greatest tragedy of the Eldar's history. their inability to balance their own greatness with the humility required to guide the galaxy toward a better future. But even in their failure, the Eldar remain a fascinating and tragic race. They are a race defined by their flaws, their brilliance, and their tragic fall from grace. In the end, the Eldar's story is one of what could have been, what was, and what will never be. Theories about their fate continue to swirl, and fans speculate endlessly about the potential futures that could have awaited them. Could they have truly avoided the birth of Slaanesh? Could they have succeeded in their attempt to reclaim the Webway? The questions remain unanswered, but they continue to captivate the minds of fans who see in the Eldar's downfall not just a tragedy, but a cautionary tale about the dangers of excess, arrogance, and the inevitable consequences of chasing perfection. Ultimately, the Eldar's failure is a defining moment in the history of the galaxy, one that shaped the future of all races. Their story is a reminder of the fragility of greatness and the cost of unchecked ambition. What happened to the Eldar after the war is a story of survival, of learning from past mistakes, and of struggling to reclaim what was lost. But their story will always be a tale of what might have been, one of the greatest civilizations to ever exist, brought low by their own hubris. The war in the Webway stands as one of the most defining failures in the history of the Eldar, a failure that irrevocably altered the course of their civilization and reshaped their future in ways that no one could have predicted. It was a war born from desperation, the Eldar's final attempt to fight back against the monstrous forces they had unleashed. Yet, despite their intelligence, their technological superiority, and their ancient wisdom, the Eldar were ultimately unable to stop the chaos they had sown. The birth of Slaanesh and the subsequent breakdown of their empire were not just acts of fate. They were the direct consequence of the Eldar's own excesses, and the war in the Webway was their last, futile effort to undo the damage they had caused. In the end, the war's failure was not just a matter of losing battles. It was the collapse of an entire way of life, a civilization that had once been the most advanced in the galaxy, reduced to fractured remnants that struggled to survive. The impact of this failure on the Eldar was profound. The war didn't just shatter their empire, it shattered their very identity. The Eldar had once been a race of intellectuals, artists, and philosophers, a people who prided themselves on their elegance and refinement. But after the war, they were no longer a cohesive, united civilization. The birth of Slaanesh had fractured them, and the Webway, once a symbol of their technological mastery, had become the site of their destruction. The Eldar now found themselves scattered across the galaxy, a broken people with no central authority and no common purpose. Some retreated into the safety of the craft worlds, while others, like the Drukhari, embraced a dark path, forsaking their former ideals in favor of survival through cruelty and excess. The war in the Webway was the event that defined the Eldar as they are today, haunted by their past, struggling with their identity, and forever burdened by the knowledge that they were responsible for their own downfall. The failure of the war also had a profound psychological impact on the survivors. Those who managed to escape the destruction were left to contend with the guilt and shame of their race's failure. The Eldar knew that they were not the victims of some external force. They had created the chaos that led to their destruction. Their hedonistic pursuit of perfection, their indulgence in excess, had given birth to Slaanesh, and in doing so they had doomed themselves. Some Eldar attempted to move on, focusing on survival and the preservation of their culture, while others, like the Drukhari, embraced the darkness that had been born from their own sins. The psychological scars of the war ran deep, and the Eldar would carry those scars for the rest of their existence. They had once been the pinnacle of the galaxy, but now they were a broken people, clinging to what little remained of their former greatness. Yet, despite their fall, the Eldar's story is not one of complete despair. The craft worlds, while remnants of a shattered empire, remain symbols of the Eldar's resilience. Though they are no longer the masters of the stars, the Eldar still possess incredible technological and psychic power. They are a race in exile, but not a race without hope. Fans often debate whether the Eldar's eventual survival is a form of redemption, or simply the continuation of their struggle for a lost glory that can never be fully reclaimed. In many ways, the Eldar's survival is a testament to their strength, a strength that lies not in their ability to conquer the galaxy, but in their ability to survive despite the weight of their past mistakes. Some fans argue that the Eldar's continued existence is a tragedy in itself. They are a race that has already lived through the worst catastrophe imaginable, and yet they continue to fight on. Their future is uncertain, and their place in the galaxy is no longer clear. The Eldar may have been the galaxy's most advanced civilization, but now they are just another player in a universe that has moved on without them. Others, however, see the Eldar as a tragic yet noble race, one that still strives to preserve their culture and their ideals despite the overwhelming odds. The question of whether the Eldar will ever truly recover from their fall is one that fans have pondered for years, and it remains a key point of interest for many. A recurring theory among fans is that the Eldar, in their pursuit of redemption, will eventually find a way to break free from the cycle of suffering they are trapped in. Some speculate that the Eldar may one day find a way to heal the rift caused by the birth of Slaanesh, perhaps through a great unification of their fractured factions, or by discovering a hidden power within the Webway that could restore them to their former glory. This theory suggests that the Eldar's fate is not yet sealed, and that there may still be a chance for them to reclaim the galaxy and in some way make amends for the sins of their past. Whether or not this is possible remains to be seen, but it offers a glimmer of hope for a people whose future is uncertain. Others take a more cynical view, arguing that the Eldar's failure is a reflection of the fundamental flaws within their society. Their pursuit of perfection, their arrogance, and their inability to see the consequences of their actions were always going to lead them to this point. The fall of the Eldar, in this view, was not just inevitable. It was a necessary step in the broader story of the galaxy. The Eldar's downfall allowed other races, such as humanity, to rise and take their place in the stars. The galaxy needed the Eldar to fall in order to create a more balanced universe. In this sense, the Eldar's continued survival is not a triumph, but a quiet, painful acknowledgement of their failure. Another interesting theory revolves around the role of the Inari, a faction of Eldar who seek to find a way to resurrect the Eldar gods and bring about a new dawn for their people. The Inari represent a new approach to the Eldar's future, one that seeks to reconnect them with the divine aspects of their past. Some fans see the Inari as the Eldar's best hope for salvation, while others view them with skepticism, seeing them as a group willing to make dangerous pacts and sacrifices in their quest for redemption. The Inari are a symbol of the Eldar's struggle to overcome their past, but whether their efforts will succeed or doom the Eldar to another cycle of destruction remains to be seen. Theories about the Eldar's future are as varied as the factions within their race. Some see them as a tragic example of a civilization that peaked too soon, while others believe they still have the potential to rise again. What is undeniable, however, is the fact that the Eldar's story is far from over. The war in the Webway may have been their greatest failure, but it is not the end of their tale. The Eldar remain one of the most fascinating and complex races in the Warhammer 40k universe, and their struggle for survival, redemption, or perhaps simply to maintain their place in the galaxy will continue to captivate fans for years to come. Ultimately, the Eldar's downfall is a story of pride, excess, and tragedy. It is the story of a race that had everything, knowledge, power, and grace, but lost it all through their own faults. Yet, in their survival, they show the strength to endure, to learn from their mistakes, and perhaps even to rebuild. Theories about their future may be filled with uncertainty, but the legacy of the Eldar, shaped by their failures and their resilience, will always be one of the most compelling tales in the grimdark universe of Warhammer 40K.